The first step to eternal life was to jam an iron hook up the dead man's nose. You would twist it, liquefying the brain, and let it drain out into a bowl. This wasn't a desecration, it was a sacred rite, and only the first step in the brutal reality of Egyptian mummification. Welcome, seeker, to the Obscuria vault. Today, we unseal the records on a practice so famous, we think we know it. But the truth of Egyptian mummification is a story written in blood, salt, and a terrifyingly profound belief in what lies beyond death. To understand why a civilization would go to such gruesome lengths, you must first understand what it meant to die in ancient Egypt. To them, death was not an end, but a dangerous transition. Every human being possessed two souls, the ka, a spiritual twin or life force that lived on in the tomb, and the ba, a human-headed bird that represented one's personality, which could travel between the world of the living and the dead. But there was a terrible catch. Each night, the wandering ba soul had to return to its home to be rejuvenated by the ka, and the only way the ba could find its ka was by recognizing its physical body. If the body decayed, the ba would be lost forever, and the soul would be annihilated. A second and final death. This is why mummification was not a choice, but an absolute, terrifying necessity. The body had to be preserved, no matter the cost. The journey began the moment after the last breath. The family would hand over the deceased to a team of professional embalmers, priests who worked in a special tent known as the Ebu, the place of purification. This was not a somber, quiet affair. It was a workshop of the dead, filled with specialized tools and the scent of incense and decay. The first step was a ritual cleansing. The body was washed thoroughly with palm wine, its high alcohol content acting as an antiseptic to kill surface bacteria. It was then rinsed with sacred water brought from the Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt itself. As they worked, the chief embalmer, wearing the jackal-headed mask of Anubis, the god of embalming, would recite prayers, consecrating the body and protecting it from evil spirits during this vulnerable state. But this gentle washing was merely the calm before the storm. With the body purified, the true work began, and it started with the brain. The Egyptians considered the brain to be useless, mere skull stuffing. It had no value in the afterlife, and worse, it was a mass of soft tissue that would rot quickly, so it had to be removed. The process was called excerebration. A long iron hook, sometimes spoon-like, sometimes barbed, was carefully inserted through the nostril and hammered through the thin ethmoid bone at the back of the nose, piercing into the cranial cavity. The embalmer would then violently twist and churn the hook, whisking the brain into a semi-liquid state. The head was then tilted forward, and the liquefied brain matter was allowed to drain out through the nostrils into a waiting bowl, to be discarded with other medical waste. Not all of it could be removed this way. The remaining pieces were pulled out with long tweezers. Next came the organs of the torso. A ritual scribe would mark a long incision line on the left side of the abdomen. Then another priest, called the ripper, would make the cut using a sharpened knife of Ethiopian stone, obsidian, a blade so sharp it was said to be magical. Once the incision was made, the ripper would be ritually chased away as the act of injuring the dead was a grave sin, even when necessary. Through this opening, the embalmers would reach inside and remove the internal organs by hand: the liver, the lungs, the stomach, and the intestines. The abdominal cavity was now an empty, gaping space, but one organ was always deliberately left behind: the heart. The Egyptians believed the heart was the seat of intelligence, emotion, and memory. It was the most important part of a person, and in the afterlife, it would be weighed on the scales of justice against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth. If the heart was heavier than the feather, it would be devoured by the demon Amit, and the soul would cease to exist. A heart heavy with sin had no place in paradise. The removed organs, however, were vital for the afterlife. They were washed, dried, and packed into 4 sacred containers known as canopic jars. Each jar was a holy vessel, protected by one of the 4 sons of the god Horus. Imseti, with his human head, guarded the liver. Hapi, the baboon-headed god, guarded the lungs. Domutef, the jackal, guarded the stomach. And Kebesinwef, the falcon, guarded the intestines. These jars would be placed in the tomb with the mummy, ensuring the deceased was whole again in the afterlife. The now empty body cavity was thoroughly rinsed again with palm wine and packed with linen, sawdust and fragrant herbs like myrrh and cinnamon to help it hold its shape. The real preservation was about to begin. The body was laid on a sloping table and completely covered, inside and out, with heaps of natron, a natural, dehydrating salt harvested from the dry riverbeds near the Nile. For 40 days, the body remained buried in this mountain of salt. The natron aggressively drew out every last drop of moisture from the skin, muscles, and fat. The process was brutally effective, halting bacterial decay completely. But the transformation was horrifying. The corpse would shrink and shrivel. The skin would become tight, black, and leathery. The features would contort. What was once a human being was now a blackened skeletal husk, preserved but barely recognizable. This 40-day period mirrored the 40 days the star Sirius was absent from the night sky, a time of purification before its rebirth. After 40 days, the husk was removed from the natron. It was now dry, brittle, and eternal. The final stage was to restore a semblance of humanity and provide magical protection. This was the art of wrapping, a painstaking ritual that could take over 2 weeks. First, the body was cleaned one last time and anointed with a mixture of fragrant oils and coated in a thick, protective layer of resin. Then, the wrapping began. Hundreds of yards of the finest linen, torn into strips, were used. The process was intricate. Each finger and each toe was wrapped individually. Then the limbs, then the torso and head. But this was not just bandaging. It was a magical fortification. Between the layers of linen, priests would place dozens of magical amulets at specific, crucial points on the body: an ankh amulet for life, a jed pillar for stability, and most importantly, a heart scarab, a large stone beetle amulet inscribed with a spell from the Book of the Dead, was placed directly over the heart. This spell magically prevented the heart from testifying against the deceased during the final judgment. Often, entire papyrus scrolls inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead were wrapped with the mummy. These were cheat sheets for the afterlife, maps and incantations to help the soul navigate the treacherous underworld and overcome the monstrous demons that guarded the gates of paradise. On the 70th day, the process was complete. For a pharaoh or a great noble, the iconic golden death mask, an idealized portrait of the deceased as a god, was placed over the head and shoulders of the wrapped mummy. The mummy was then placed in a series of nested coffins, each a masterpiece of religious art, before being sealed in its final sarcophagus. On the day of the funeral, before the tomb was sealed, the priests performed the most vital ritual of all, the opening of the mouth ceremony. The sarcophagus was stood upright, and the chief priest, using a ritual adze and other sacred instruments, would touch the mouth, eyes, nose, and ears of the mummy's mask. This was not symbolic. It was a powerful act of magic, believed to reanimate the mummy's senses, allowing its soul to see, hear, speak, and eat the offerings left for it in the afterlife. The body was no longer just a preserved corpse. It was a reactivated vessel for the soul. The journey was complete. From a beloved family member to an embalmer's slab, through hooks and knives, salt and resin, linen and magic, the body was now a permanent statue of flesh, ready to house its soul for millions of years. The Egyptian process of mummification was not a peaceful slumber. It was a violent, gruesome, and incredibly complex act of defiance against the natural order of decay. It was a medical nightmare, a brutal art form, and a profound act of faith, all rolled into one. The path to eternal paradise was paved with the guts, brains, and broken bodies of those desperate to make the journey.